Good afternoon. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US. Thanks very much for joining us today. You are here for our webinar on solar financing, the Department of Energy and data standards, reducing costs to expand opportunities. We're very happy to have with us today a number of great speakers. I'm going to read to you their bios. You have a little bit of a background on them, and then we'll go straight into talk about our agenda. Our first speaker will be Daniel Boff. Daniel is an analyst at the Sunshot Initiative at the U.S. Department of Energy. He's an analyst providing on-the-spot market analysis to support DOE decision makers. Dan also helps manage a diverse portfolio of projects for Sunshot's soft costs team, including research, demonstration, and deployment projects, as well as data standardization. Before he joined Sunshot, Dan worked as an intern at the Solar Energy Industries Association, supporting state policy teams, and also for Sol Systems, a solar renewable energy credit trader and solar project finance provider. Our second speaker today will be Tom Tansy. Tom is chairman of the SunSpec Alliance, where he leads the distributed energy industry's efforts to establish data and communication standards that enable integration of solar PV and storage into the smart grid. The SunSpec Alliance has more than 100 stakeholders worldwide, including leading fleet operators, component suppliers, software developers, and utilities. Before joining SunSpec, Tom was general manager and VP of business development for Power One and helped start electric vehicle manufacturer Zero Motorcycles. Our third speaker will be Campbell Pry, president and CEO of XBRL US. Campbell brings a lot of experience in technology development, accounting, and finance. Before joining as president and CEO, Campbell led the development and maintenance of taxonomies as chief standards officer, and he played an integral role on the executive team. Campbell joined from Morgan Stanley, where he was executive director in the institutional securities group, managing the equity research XBRL-based valuation framework. Campbell's been involved with XBRL since 2001 and was chairman of the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee, leading the build of the US GAAP taxonomy under contract with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before joining Morgan Stanley, Campbell was a partner in the risk and advisory practice of KPMG. For our session today, let me just tell you a little bit about our agenda. First, we're going to have Dan is going to take us through a Department of Energy update on the Orange Button project. We're then going to move on to Tom covering the solar industry outlook and talk about some opportunities there. I'm the VP of Communication at XBRL US, and I'm going to be covering the XBRL Financial Data Standard and give you a little bit of background on that. Then we're going to turn to Campbell, who's going to talk to you more specifically about the Orange Button taxonomy, and then we'll get into how you can get involved. So before we get started, and I turn this over to Dan, I just want to cover a couple of logistics. You can see that there is a Q&A link at the top of your screen, and if you have questions, please post your questions there. Just key them in on your to the console, and we'll be taking questions throughout the program. So we'll be stopping after each speaker to cover a couple of questions. If you have any kind of technical problems, just send us an email at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to walk us through the Orange Button project a little bit. Dan?
Great, thanks, Michelle. Let's see here. Hopefully this works. Okay, hopefully folks can see this, but just again, my name is Dan Boff. I'm with the Department of Energy, and the DOE is actually the funder of the Orange Button standard. And what I'd like to do over the next couple of minutes is essentially sort of give you a brief overview of what our mission is, some of the background that we have in funding this project, before turning it over to the other speakers to essentially talk about some of the more some of the greater details of the project, about the taxonomy, about the use cases. So the Sunshot program at the Department of Energy is a cross-cutting program that's really designed to reduce the cost of energy from sort of very high costs that we saw at the beginning of the decade down to about 6 cents per kilowatt hour by the year 2020. This would make solar essentially cost competitive with fossil fuels. And recently, in the past couple of months, a lot of analysts have projected that we're sort of going to be reaching this goal essentially in the next couple of years. So we've decided to get a little bit more ambitious and are currently looking to further reduce the cost of solar energy to about 3 cents per kilowatt hour by the year 2030. And we have a variety of different sort of strategic focus areas that we use to accomplish this goal. So the first two are really early stage research and development, both in photovoltaics and concentrating solar power. So this includes things like how to improve solar efficiencies, looking at novel materials like perovskites, which you may have heard of. But then we have these 3 cross-cutting programs. So the systems integration program deals with novel ways to integrate solar electricity into the electric grid. The Tech to Market program really deals with how to spur innovation in small businesses and promote American manufacturing. And then there's the Soft Cost program, which is the program that's funding this orange button work. And there are a lot of different definitions for the soft costs or balance of systems costs for solar energy. Usually when asked to give a definition, most people will say, oh, it's things like financing and it's things like permitting. But we really define soft costs as transaction costs or barriers that are really the result of a lack of information. Essentially, somebody doesn't have the knowledge that they need to effectively and efficiently do their job. And that results either in an increased cost through lost efficiency or a lost opportunity. So our motivations in funding the Orange Button program is to help spur efficiency and data transfer between solar developers and sort of other folks that interact with solar data. And we think there are tremendous opportunities for cost reduction here, especially in the realm of financing. So we look to sort of 4 strategic areas to help accomplish some of these soft cost goals. So the first is, as you can see, is networking and technical assistance, which is a key component of the Orange Button program. We're really looking to have industry drive the program, help define their needs, and help build this standard sort of so they can take a lot of ownership of it. And the second 2 are data analysis and business innovation, which is what we really hope to enable with the Orange Button standard. We want to sort of make folks in the business community be able to transact data more easily and perform more sophisticated analytics based on the new data standard, which sort of brings us to where we are today. So Orange Button is currently 1 year into a 2-year program that the DOE will be funding. We've had a lot of great input from industry, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing from you all and for your continued involvement. And I'm going to let some of the other speakers get into some of the more, the greater nuances of the program. But I think before we sort of sign off, and I pass the baton back over to Tom, we've got time for a question or 2.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yes, we have a question from the audience, and just as a reminder, if you do have questions, just click on the Q&A link, and then you can key in your question. We'll take them as we go through. So the question we have is, what other Sunshot programs are geared towards reducing soft costs besides Orange Button?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we fund a really wide variety of programs stemming from working with cities to improve their permitting processes, working to develop new training programs for solar installers. But I think one of the more interesting ones for this audience would be the SAPC program, which we funded a couple of years ago. This was sort of another standardization initiative. Really, it was done through the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and was really aimed at looking at ways to securitize solar projects. So they created a number of things, including model contracts that are used by a lot of the solar developers out there, and have sort of formed the foundation of securitized solar assets.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think actually, I think we will go ahead and move on to the next part of the program, which will be Tom. But we may have questions that are coming in for you, and we'll take additional questions at the end, Dan. Okay, so thanks very much, and I'm going to take over the screen now and share my screen, and we'll go back to our presentation here. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk about the solar market.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. So my name is Tom Tansy. I'm the chairman of the SunSpec Alliance, and we are leading the development of these orange button standards and taxonomies with our partners. So what do we get involved in this endeavor? Well, as is implied in our name, we're all about solar energy. And one of the reasons we're about solar energy is it's such a great business. It's a huge market, and it is just growing leaps and bounds. So this year we achieved 10 gigawatts of new capacity, and that's double the rate that we had just 3 years ago. So 39% of all new energy installs across the board in the U.S. last year were solar energy, and so that's a really impressive number. The reason why this has come about is that the costs have been declining rapidly, and solar is becoming more and more competitive. Since the Sunshot Initiative really started, costs are down 70% in terms of the hardware. Now, the soft costs have been a little bit more stubborn and represent more of a challenge, but of course, that's why we're focused here on the orange button, is to drive out those transaction costs that Dan was mentioning. If you take a look at the chart, you can see that the marketplace has been going up and to the right year on year for some time now, but it's bumpy and it's lumpy, and that's really driven by the changing incentive structures across the board, where you see the big spike there in the 2016 timeframe, which is all about the investment tax credit change and so forth. But overall, the trend is looking very positive for the reason that solar really gets more competitive by the month here. So we would expect that because it's a good business, that this will continue on into the future. Next slide, please. Another great aspect about this business is what a tremendous creator of jobs it is. So the US DOE employment report just this month published some new statistics about what's happening in the energy sector overall, and what we discovered is that about 55% of the total energy workforce is working in either solar or wind. That is, to me, an astonishing figure based upon where we come from. 43% of that energy workforce is in the solar sector alone, and that's great news for our country, and this is actually one of the fastest growing sectors in the marketplace. It complements and rides alongside what's happening in the natural gas sector quite well, and as you can see, the competition that's being provided by solar with all other sources is very strong. Next, please. Now, with such a big and vibrant market, you can well imagine that there are data requirements that come really from every direction. And what this is driven by is that there's a large degree of variability in the finance requirements in each market sector. And of course, this increases the challenge of establishing standards. But fortunately, there is a lot of commonality, and this is, again, where Orange Button comes in. So let's take a look at the requirements within these market sectors, which are generally broken into 3 categories. The first category of factors or data requirements come from customer motivation. So why is a residential homeowner or commercial building operator or utility investing in solar energy in the first place? The second aspect in terms of the requirements comes from the financing options. So based upon where that energy off-taker or customer is sitting, what are the tools that they have at their disposal to build the plant and equipment that's required to generate the renewable energy? And then finally, the key factors or hurdles that influence the investment decision. So, what are the particular buying factors and so forth? So as we drill down into these various aspects, starting with residential, what you see there is a consumer base that's really driven by a desire for energy independence and additionally, of course, traditionally for a concern for the environment. These customers are really less cost sensitive. Not to say that they don't care about costs, but they certainly do. They want the amount that they spend on energies to be competitive with what's happening out there in the marketplace in general from their utility, but that's not the only factor. So this is where things like net metering and the like, the cost of energy, of course, comes into play here. The financing options that this sector has at its disposal are those that are typical for consumer purchases, your loans, your leases, and new for this sector, potentially fractional ownership in a community-based solar system. Looking at the commercial sector, it's a bit different. The value proposition here is all about operational savings. So energy is a huge cost of many businesses, and so that and their bill is largely dictated by their highest peak demand in a given month. So their principal motivation here is keeping down those demand charges, which are driven by spikes in demand for energy. They're also, of course, looking for tax relief. Now, these organizations have many of the same tools available at their disposal as would consumers, loans, leases, and PPAs. But what changes here is that we don't have a FICO score. In residential, we always have the FICO score to determine the safety of an investment decision, at least in the consumer. Here, that is substituted by credit analysis for the individual company, which is a bit more challenging. Other factors that come into play here are who owns the building. It's always easy to finance if the occupant of the building is actually the owner. What type of credit does that business have? And then ultimately, what is their energy use profile, which again drives a data need. So that we need the fine-grained data to determine, is this going to be a good investment for the commercial sector? And then finally, moving into the utility sector, here the motivations were initially regulatory compliance, largely with renewable portfolio standards. And as time has gone on, the motivation has really shifted to being cost. What's the lowest cost of energy overall in plant and equipment to produce that energy? This sector also has PPAs at its disposal, similar to residential and commercial, but more so rate base would be a way that they would finance it, or the issuance of bonds and the likes. And so what influences their decision to invest? Well, it's really the preferences and the dictates of the utility commission, and then, of course, the cost of the alternatives. What are the other sources of energy that we might use? And again, solar is coming out to be a good competitor in all these places. And of course, what's needed here is the infrastructure and the standards to drive this type of finance market. Next, please. Now that we know where the requirements are coming from, well, what shapes them? And that is the project lifecycle. And so why is that? So for each stage of the project lifecycle, you're going to have a different type of financing. And so these represent transactions as we move from one step to the next. In the development stage, of course, this is a case where the developer is going out and determining the need for solar power in the first place, trying to find the customer, determining if all the right entitlements are available, and so forth. And so the financing that's done here is the equity stage, and it's quite often sweat equity. But in any case, all the information about the plant, the equipment, the entitlements, the regulatory environment are collected at this stage. Assuming that all works out, that the plant seems like it's going to be feasible, you get all the various component parts in place, whether you then qualify to go into the construction stage. So in the construction stage, the debt gets added to the equity that's already there. But a lot of the data that was collected in the development stage, of course, can be passed along. It's then increased, enhanced by new factors that are associated strictly with that debt. Now, after some period of time, the plant gets built and the construction financing needs to get paid off while we move into an operational stage. And in here, tax equity enters the play. So this is a case where the operational stage we're going to finance for 10 or 20 years, and so tax equity can play a part here. And in lower cost debt replaces the higher cost construction debt. So once again, data can get reused at every stage, but now you add in the requirement for surveillance reporting. In other words, are people paying their bills? Are the plants still working in place? Are the service providers providing the O&M? Are they doing their job, and is everything working out financially? So you can see you have sort of a snowballing effect as more data gets added to sort of the core that was built up at the development stage. To manage all this, of course, you need the data standards, because really without it, we start to come into scale issues. If we had to do all these transactions one at a time, it would be an expensive proposition. But if we can understand what the requirements are at each, we can standardize that via Orange Button and bring the market to scale. Next, please. And here enters the Orange Button. So Orange Button is really an exciting program. We're really so thrilled to be part of it. It's been a vision of the SunSpec Alliance to enable this. We really have the notion that once the data is put into play, it needs to be shared and used everywhere. As in every other industry that's gone through this sort of rapid growth, ultimately you move to an environment where access to information becomes the limiting factor. And if you can provide that information in a standardized method, then more parties can play and new capital sources open up. And so that's why we're doing the Orange Button, and we certainly welcome everyone on this call to participate in the effort. Now, to help convince you to do so, I'd like to turn it back over to my colleague, Michelle, to take you through the details about how the Orange Button works and how taxonomy development works.
Great, thanks, Tom. We have a couple of questions I want to ask you before we move on. Tom, you talked about getting a lot of people involved, including people that are listening in on this call. What kinds of companies are you looking for to get involved, and what kinds of input do you need, and who's gotten involved so far?
Sure. Yeah, we're looking, of course, for project developers, those that are building plants and portfolios of solar assets. We're looking for all different aspects of the banking sector, those that are involved in project finance and in securitization finance and so forth, market making, the various service providers, the auditors and the accountants and the legal teams that put together the structures that are required to bring these products to market. Of course, independent engineers, O&M providers, and other related parties. So what we've had the fortune of having very broad participation, several hundred companies at this point. I'll also mention another important sector would be the state green banks. They're going to play an important part of bringing finance to market, and all these types of parties have been involved. So we have representation across all these different sectors. We've had companies like Sunrun and Solar City and Wells Fargo and KPMG and Ernst & Young and Black & Veatch, and I mean the list sort of goes on and on. But the more the merrier, because this is about creating a vibrant marketplace, and so we need, and it's a big marketplace. I mean, we're probably in this country generated roughly, I think, 300 billion in terms of new plant and equipment sales here. So this is a big market, it's growing fast, and so really we welcome one and all.
Great, thanks. And one more question, Tom. The focus of this session is really on the finance part of the taxonomy, but are there other areas of the solar process beyond financing that you're including in the taxonomy build?
Sure, yeah, by all means. Yeah, so solar finance does not live in isolation. It's directly connected to design, to operations, to construction, to maintenance, et cetera. And so our initiative encompasses all of those different areas. And again, it gets to the point that one of the points I mentioned earlier, which is about data reuse. So when you're developing a project, of course, the developer has to work with all those entities that I mentioned, whether it's design, construction, operations, et cetera, to get initial indicative figures about the feasibility of the project. And so once those figures are collected, you want that to roll forward into the various software applications that are ultimately going to result in the production of a distributed energy plant. And so this particular webinar is focused in on the finance aspect, but we'll be doing another webinar, at least one more, that'll cover those other operational aspects. And I believe some of this information will be covered later on in this presentation as well.
Great. And just one more question, Tom. Is Orange Button involved in promoting uniform communication standards in connection with smart inverters?
Good question. You know, it's really more about taxonomy development, and it's about interchange standards. Now, it leverages these communication protocols, which of course have associated information models with them. But the emphasis here is less on how the bits get moved from A to B, and more about what do these bits and bytes actually mean. So as I think Campbell's going to go through, when we say what does it mean when we say a solar plant or residential plant, or what does it mean when we say income? What do these terms mean? That's really what we're focusing on. And then secondarily, how you move them from A to B. We do cover that, of course, with the Orange Button standard largely addresses software applications as opposed to software protocols. So in the context of software applications, those quite often transport their data using common internet protocols, HTTP and TCP/IP and so forth. So as part of this initiative, we are developing web services APIs. But what's happening in grid interconnection and so forth is really supportive of the Orange Button effort.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so we're gonna move on now, and next we're gonna take a bit of a deeper dive into the financial data standard itself. And when we think about financial data standards, they really need to be developed in a collaborative process, a process that is very clearly defined to all the stakeholders to that data collection process, to creators, which could be developers, could be investors, could be contractors, to data intermediaries, and then of course to end users of the data. And if the program is implemented successfully, then we will be successful at reaping the benefits of standards, like lowering costs, reducing fraud, increasing accuracy, and making data more timely. And that's really what we're attempting to do with Orange Button. We're attempting to take what is today a paper-based process, as you see on the screen here, taking that paper and converting it into something that is computer readable, and that can be automated and immediately read by a computer, so that the data collection process is no longer manual, but is automated. So with that, we've chosen to use XBRL as the financial data standard. And XBRL stands for Extensible Business Reporting Language, and it was chosen for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it was uniquely developed to communicate the very unique features of financial data. Only by consistently conveying attributes like time period, like units, which could be a currency or it could be kilowatt hours, by communicating things like dimensional aspects of financial data. Only by consistently conveying that metadata can the data collection process be automated. XBRL is also an open standard, and that means that there are no licensing fees associated with its use, so it's freely available for everybody to use. XBRL is also, it's widely used both in the US and around the world. Today, every US public company is required to report their financials in XBRL format to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that includes all publicly traded utilities, solar development companies, financial institutions, many of the same organizations that are going to be using the Orange Button taxonomy are already reporting in XBRL today. So we'll be able to leverage that knowledge base that exists out there. And finally, XBRL harmonizes with existing standards like US GAAP accounting standards, like UK GAAP, like ISO standards. And for Orange Button, we intend to leverage many of the existing financial standards and solar standards that are already being used. Things like the SunSpec standards, IECRE, different standards that we can build upon so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So let's take a look at how XBRL is able to communicate the unique aspects of financial information. This slide just shows a balance sheet for SolarCity. SolarCity is publicly traded. They file their financials every quarter in XBRL format. And if we look at this one value, 902,138, we understand the meaning of that value because we can read the rows and columns. We know that it's reported in thousands of US dollars. We know it's for the time period 2015. We know that it represents total current assets. But a computer that receives this value on its own is unable to interpret this as anything except a string of numbers. And that's where XBRL comes into play. So we're looking at the same balance sheet here, but we've blown it up a little bit so it's easier to read. Here's how XBRL works. XBRL embeds context into each reported fact so that when the value is received by the end user, they have consistently reported metadata on the time period, on the reporting entity, on other features of that fact, so they know exactly what it is. And this slide shows the descriptive information that's associated with the value 902,138. If we read this clockwise, we can see the metadata associated with the value is reporting entity, which here is Solar City. We see that it's in US dollars, that's the units it's associated with. The decimals are in thousands, the time period is 2015, and the concept is current assets. So not shown on this table, but also included in the taxonomy that we're developing are definitions, like the definition of current assets, authoritative references, if those are available, like FASB references, or it could be a reference to IECRE or a SunSpec standard, and in other kinds of information that may help the creator of the data select the appropriate data field for that value, and also helps the user of that data understand the data point. As I mentioned, XBRL is a global standard. This chart shows basically where it's used around the world. It's used in 60 countries by over 10 million companies, both public and private. It's used by over 100 regulators. In the US, 8,000 banks today report their financial statements on a quarterly basis to the FDIC. 6,000 public companies report to the SEC. And mutual funds and credit rating agencies also report to the SEC in XBRL format. Outside the US, XBRL is also used on a very wide basis. It's used for public companies, it's used by private companies, by banks, by governments. So it's a very widely used standard, and I think that's really part of its key selling point. So let's take a look at how it's used in the US. There are massive amounts of data collected by the SEC every quarter. They maintain a system called EDGAR, Electronic Data Gathering and Retrieval System. The 6,000 public companies we talked about before submit their financials as well as their notes to financials to EDGAR every quarter. The SEC immediately makes this data available as individual XBRL files. They also make it available as an RSS feed and a selected sets of data to the public. The data is freely available to everybody and is pulled by data providers. If you look at the graph on the diagram here on the right side, data providers like Standard & Poor's, Thomson Reuters, Morningstar, Bloomberg, they all extract that data. They put it into their databases, they may clean it up, they may perform other analyses on it, normalize it, and then they make it available in turn to their clients. The data is also available to the public. It's available to investors, to public companies doing peer analysis, to the media doing their own analysis. XBRL data has been made available since 2009, so there's a huge amount of history available, and there's a competitive marketplace of tools that help create XBRL data, extract it, and analyze it. These XBRL-enabled tools, and frankly any tool that can work with XML data, can be easily adapted to work with the orange button taxonomy that we're developing right now. And these tools will also be available to work with all of the orange button data that will be created using that taxonomy. That will aid the adoption effort and make sure that the data that we produce is going to be easily accessible, it's going to be timely, it's going to be more accurate, and it's going to be available in an automated fashion. So the last thing I talked about was harmonizing with other data standards. And as we build the orange button standards, we plan on leveraging existing standards that are already in use. Financial standards, construction standards, energy standards. This means that we'll be working with data fields that many stakeholders are already accustomed to, and that'll ease the path to adoption. We start with the US GAAP taxonomy. This is the taxonomy that's used by all of those US-based publicly listed companies reporting to the SEC. Today, that taxonomy contains about 15,000 data fields. It covers the financial statements. It also covers the notes to the financial statements. For the orange button taxonomy, we'll be taking a small subset of that list of terms. On top of that, we're going to be adding in some data fields that we have developed working with the surety industry and the insurance industry. So we're developing what's called a work-in-process construction project performance data. This reports costs and revenues and profits for individual contractors. And this is something else that will be very helpful for us in the orange button standards. And then on top of that, we'll layer in the very specific solar data fields, drawing on standards such as IECRE, IEEE, SunSpec standards, and then also some finance contributed data sets that we'll be using as well. So in sum, we think that we'll likely end up with an orange button standard numbering around 1,000 data fields. So with that, that gives you a little bit of a picture of XBRL, and I'm going to turn it over to Campbell, who is going to talk to us more closely about the taxonomy itself. So Campbell? I think Campbell may be on mute right now.
We could go to the next slide, please, and we'll get into a little more detail on what the actual taxonomy contains. So developing the taxonomy, as Tom had mentioned earlier, there's a number of areas that we're looking at. Is the feasibility, the operation, the finance, the construction, and the design. So, Michelle, if you could click through those and bring those up, that'd be great. One of the things that we're doing with the taxonomy, as Michelle mentioned, is we're building or we're stacking the taxonomy using different standards from different locations. So, in terms of financial performance, we want to reuse a lot of the standard elements that have already been defined for financial performance, like revenues and costs, so that you can evaluate what's the cost of a given standard. So for example, in the SunSpec and in the solar taxonomy, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to identify what are all the terms that are in addition to what we typically see in US GAAP. So in any solar project, there's a lot of metrics that are used in order to determine whether you should finance a project, and a lot of these are related to feasibility, operation, construction, and design. So there was a question asked earlier about inverter protocols. The details of how an inverter talks to the components isn't being standardized, but things about, if you're looking at a plant, how many inverters are used, what's the manufacturer of the inverter, what's the efficiency of the inverter, what are the warranty terms of the inverter. All that type of information is being defined in the standard, so that information is important information from a funding perspective. If someone's going to fund the project, or if you've been participating in a securitization of that project at some point in the future, that's information you may want to know. And in fact, in any solar project, there's a lot more information that you're going to need to be able to evaluate whether you want to invest in the project, more so than there is over more generic products like a bond or a security. So, we talked about project origination there, but as part of this, there's a lot of separate agreements that are signed, and a lot of this information is captured in a lot of different places. Typically, what's happened in the past, not only in solar, but in many areas where this data is collected, you may see different XML schemas used for something like an EPC agreement, the continued operations, the PPA agreement. All these types of agreements may have separate schemas that have developed to collect that individual data. However, that's very inefficient, because if someone wants to consolidate that data together, they've got to understand all those individual schemas. They've got to create interfaces between all that data. It gets very manual. People have to pull that data together. So the idea behind the taxonomy is we look at all the information that's being collected across the whole the whole spectrum of these agreements, and then standardize them. So that way, if someone's writing one of these agreements and they're collecting this data, all that data is defined in the taxonomy. And as Michelle showed on the previous slide, all these elements can be stacked on top of each other, and then they can be reused. So that means if a value is reported, for example, in a PPA agreement, then that can flow also through to other reports without manual intervention. It can all be automated, which helps reduce the soft costs. And this is possible because as each fact is referenced with its own context, as Michelle mentioned earlier, you can see each individual piece of data, it has information about itself. So you don't have to know which report it's in. It's kind of agnostic as to which report it was originally reported in, but then it can be used in multiple different ways. If it's not agnostic and that data is reported in an XML format or a CSV format, you then have to understand the details of that format for that particular report, which adds a lot of cost. Because it's identified in the taxonomy, that means that data can be referenced by a single process, and that process then can process the data. And that means the data is highly reusable, and going to be used again and again. So in this slide here, you can see, for example, we just pulled out, what type of information that may be in a PPA agreement, and these elements, are defined, but these elements could be used in a whole bunch of different places. So guaranteed output might be relevant for the whole entire plant, but it may be also relevant for particular components of the plant as well. So what we're trying to do with the taxonomy is reuse a lot of that data in the best way we possibly can. The other thing that XBRL provides too is the elements, and you often see this, it might be performance guarantee for a year or for a month. And so what XBRL does is it kind of it disconnects those, and so you can say when you report the fact, this is the performance guarantee for a month or for a year, and this means you get a lot more reusability of the elements, which means that you can use them in more locations, and it makes the data be able to be used from all facets of a solar reporting ecosystem. The other thing you'll see there is, on this one, is kilowatt hours. XBRL also has like a number of the units are defined separately from the elements, so you could report guaranteed output, but you could report that in kilowatt hours if it's a smaller project. You could report that in gigawatt hours if it's a larger project, or British thermal units, or whatever measure of energy that you wanted to report it in. So that supports that, and XBRL has a units registry, which allows you to be able to convert between those different units of measure as well. So that makes it a lot more flexible in terms of capturing this data. So in terms of this, you can think of all of this in terms of the taxonomy. It's like a pool of concepts or ways that you can define the data that's available, and that can be restructured and reused in many different locations. So that's why things like the US GAAP financial reporting taxonomy can be applied to this. So if we're capturing revenue, or we're capturing depreciation, or that type of information, sort of been defined, and those concepts can be reused. So we go to the next slide, Michelle. So here's an example where, let's say, a PPA, what we're talking about, like a PPA agreement. You can see the 20, it defines, what's the, this is the term of the PPA in purple. That's the element we're talking about. In this case, it's the unit, which is saying this is a duration of time. Duration of times using the standard W3C term, so it might be 20 days, 20 years, whatever it may be. That's defined in a standardized way. And what period it relates to is just, what is the, when the information was actually reported, and then what project does this 20 relate to. So all of this information is, available with the individual elements. So then that information then could be used if someone's looking to invest in that project. If it's a PPA signed, they can then get that information relative to that PPA. And the other thing that it allows, the other thing that XBRL has is associated with something called dimensions, which means that you can start to disaggregate data and break it up in different ways. We've got contract price here. So one of the issues, the risk associated with someone investing in some of these things, the data could get quite complicated in terms of if you've got different rates that apply at different times of the day or apply at different times over the term of the contract. That can be broken up by period as well, but then it also can be broken up by the different facets of the contract itself. So in this case, we've got on here a dimension for, this is the kilowatt hour price in year 20. Now, obviously, you wouldn't need to do that in this case because it's 0 for the whole term of the contract, which is a very good deal, by the way. So you only need to say, hey, the kilowatt hour for the contract is, 0 per year. But if these prices differ, and being able to collect that data is relatively easy in XBRL because it's got some standardized mechanism in place to deal with that. So that's kind of a background on how it works and what we're doing with the taxonomy. So at the moment we're in the process of going through and identifying all these facets, right, from the plant itself and what are the details of the plant and how it operates, what's its operational efficiency, what its projected operational efficiency is, what's the radiance that we're expecting on the solar panels, right down to some very, very detailed information that would be relevant for anyone who wants to invest or finance one of these projects, right down to where the keys for the plant are located if you need to open up the storage shed. So there's a lot of information that's been captured here, and then the idea is that that should provide a solid base so that no matter what type of agreement that's being written and then that information is being captured, that it's recorded in the taxonomy. It's available in the taxonomy to be used. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Michelle.
Campbell, thanks very much. And we have a question for you. Earlier, someone spoke about the private company use of XBRL, and many of the installations or implementations of XBRL that we've heard about are for public companies, and they're mandated. How is XBRL used by private companies?
So there's a lot of use of XBRL by private companies around the world. Typically, to date, most private company use has been around capturing financial data of a private company. So in the UK, for example, all tax returns are done in an XBRL format. So I think there's 1.5 million filings in that market. And in Holland, a lot of private company reporting is done in an XBRL format as well. So one of the other things that we've been working on is with the surety industry is to collect insurance companies to collect financial data, particularly to assess the ability to write an insurance contract on that company. So there's, one of the advantages of using XBRL in many of these circumstances is, the traditional role has been to collect all this data to do basically evaluation of a company, particularly related to a share price. What's the fundamental performance of the security? So there's a lot of information there. I think the US GAAP taxonomy has 15,000 elements in it. So there's a lot of information that can be collected so that you can make a guess about what the price of a security is going to be. And this is no different, really. This is saying, look, I've got this cash flow, but what are all the factors that are going to influence that cash flow if I'm going to basically try and get a percentage of it? So this is the same kind of thing. So whether it's public or private, I don't think really matters. That really becomes a matter of, is a regulator going to mandate the standard? So I think in this environment, just given the complexity of some of these solar projects in terms of the amount of considerations you need to make, having a standard like this is a good idea.
Great, thank you. We have some questions, some more questions for the group, and let me just move my screen here, if I can get that going. Hang on. Before we go on to next steps, why don't we, I'm just going to put this screen up. This has all of our email addresses and phone numbers in some cases, and we encourage people to, jot these down, and we will be sending the link to the replay out tomorrow. But, please note these down. If you're interested in getting involved, you can contact any one of us. And, while we have this up, let me go through some of the additional questions that we've received. One question is, are there any plans for blockchain development and integration? And this, I think maybe a question for Dan and Tom. Any thoughts on blockchain?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try that one first. Yeah, some of the companies that have joined up are those like SolarCoin, and there's a variety of others that are involved in developing SolarCoin, but Solar Change would be another one. So this is part of the ecosystem development. So with these data standards defined, applications like SolarCoin and the use of the blockchain are enabled by these standards. So yes, very much part of it.
Great, thank you. Another question is, the program is being funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, but are there any plans to take this international?
So are there plans to take the program internationally? Well, any of the standards that we develop and offer here are offered royalty free. So and from that standpoint, absolutely they can be adopted. Furthermore, the companies that are involved in solar development are some of the biggest and most important in the world, which means that they're operating across the globe as well. So this initiative really has the opportunity to turn into something that is even more broadly adopted. But right now we have our hands full with the U.S. solar market, so we'll start here. Okay,
thank you. The project is focusing on solar as as an energy source. Are there any thoughts on could this potentially be used for other types of renewable energy beyond solar, like wind or?
Sure. Again, I'll try this one. This is Tom.
Okay.
And I would say the concept that Campbell has, and you have described, Michelle, about data reuse really plays here as well. If you were to go back to that build slide where we talked about U.S. GAAP and then the construction standards and then the particular solar terms, well, included it within those particular solar terms are certain units of measures like kilowatt hours, in some cases current, voltage, O&M contract, performance guarantee, and so forth. These concepts are prevalent in the wind industry as well. Now, wind will have its own particular units or terms and so forth that need to be captured and documented, but in large part, this taxonomy should be applicable to the wind sector as well.
Great, thank you. Another question is on the timeline for Orange Button. If someone can further explain the timeline for Orange Button and what kind of commitment you're looking for from people who get involved. And Tom, I don't know if that would be you, or maybe Dan, you could cover the timeline a little bit, and then Tom, you could talk a little bit more about the commitment that you're looking for.
Sure. So the timeline is essentially we started funding this project at the beginning of last year, so we're about halfway through sort of the period of federal involvement, and there's been a lot of work done in the past year to develop use cases for what we want the standard to do. And over the next year, Tom and a lot of the folks involved in the working groups will be spending a lot of time both working sort of with folks more on the business side to refine those use cases, but also to develop some of the more technical taxonomies, exchange protocols to sort of meet the requirements of the use cases. After next year is up, federal funding for the program will sunset, but we don't expect the program to sunset. we're working with Tom and the rest of the team to develop plans to sort of continue this work and ensure that there's sort of an ongoing process of continuing to update and refine the standards. And I think I'll let Tom talk a little bit more about how the working groups themselves are functioning.
Sure. Yeah, well, a lot of hard work has been done over this first year. So we've spent a lot of time convening stakeholder groups and meeting on a weekly basis. And Michelle leads the finance task force and can go into great detail about that process. Well, the result of that process is that we've just produced the draft of the taxonomy. Now, it's a first draft, so it's very much a work in process. But it is something that very shortly will be available for public review and broader comment. And so if you're involved in the solar business and or the finance business and you want to get into the solar business, what we ask is that you engage with us, review the taxonomy while it's being built. To the extent that you want to raise your hand and offer improvements or changes to it, please do. To the extent that you want to simply adopt it and deploy it, please let us know so that we can provide additional services to you to ease that process. Now, as Dan mentioned, this is a 2-year DOE program, and the DOE was wise enough to put this program into the capable hands of Sunspec and XBRL. We have mutually as our goal is to proliferate these types of information standards more broadly. So we are incorporating the orange button standards into our standard work products. So that really ensures that we're going to have continuity, and so the marketplace is going to continue to evolve, and we'll react as we go. But there is a good solid home and support resources as a result for you as you adopt the orange button. So please get involved in review. Come to and participate in work groups if you can. Tell us if you want to adopt them. We can provide you tools and assistance to do that.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. The question is the Orange Button effort collaborating with the real estate appraisal industry, like the Appraisal Institute or the Appraisal Foundation or the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors?
Yeah, in a word, yes, absolutely. Yeah, so there are other initiatives that are taking place to make sure that multiple listing services, for example, start to track solar attributes of a home. And so we're harmonizing those efforts. And so, yes, we're trading these terms back and forth.
Great.
So no reinventing of the wheel allowed.
Absolutely. That's the whole idea behind standards. Okay. Great. I'm going to go back to, our next step slide here. And, I'll talk through these, but Tom, jump in if you want to add to this. But basically, we're looking for people to sign up now, review the taxonomy draft while it's under development. And you can email Dylan@sunspec.org, who is standing by to take your calls. The taxonomy draft is something that you can review, that we can, we'd love to get your input. Make sure you have a say in what kinds of standards are being developed that you'll be using at some point in the future. If you're not quite ready to sign up, schedule a personal informational call. You can learn more. We're happy, Tom or me or Campbell or any of us are happy to get on the phone and just talk to you a little bit more in detail about the program and what kind of, and then discuss with you what kind of commitment you're willing and able to make. We're also going to be at some of these upcoming events, so you can learn more about Orange Button. So if you're going to the Solar Power Asset Management and Performance Program in San Diego tomorrow, I'm going to be there along with some other people that are involved in Orange Button, and we'll be presenting. So come visit us and learn a little bit more. There's also Solar Asset Management North America in San Francisco in March. Sunspec is having its annual member meeting in San Francisco in March. And Tom and Campbell are both going to be at the 5th Annual Green Investing Conference in New York in April. So there's lots of different programs where you can learn more. And, or just go ahead and join one of the SunSpec working groups. I'd love to have you on my group. We meet on Monday mornings at 10:30 Pacific time. So, email us, email any of us individually, or email Dylan at sunspec.org, one of our colleagues, and, get involved, because this is the time. Tom, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that, or Dan?
Yeah, I would just like to add that we absolutely respect the time of the participants, and we're willing to meet you on your own terms. If all you have is the ability to have a conversation with us to let us know your requirements one time, that's great. If you can participate in the regular working groups, which actually I don't think will be happening every week. We're going to move to a little bit longer time period to give us ourselves a chance to do more
That's
work
right.
in between. But in any case, let's just take it that again, we'll meet you at your own terms, and whatever you can provide, we're interested in knowing what that is, because it's all about disseminating knowledge about the standard as much as it is developing it.
Great, thank you. And Dan or Campbell, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we close?
I'll just echo Tom's sentiment. If you're interested, if you want to learn more, we really encourage you guys to reach out, regardless of whether or not you're totally comfortable with the time commitment. So please don't hesitate to stay in touch.
Great, thank you. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we will, as Tom said, there will be another program similar to this, but covering some of the other topic areas in the coming months. And so, watch your emails, and please contact us if you're interested in getting involved. There's a lot more to do, but we do have a starting point, so it's time to review. Thanks again, and we'll see you all at the next XBRL US event. Thanks.